Hello, and welcome to a walkthrough of the virtual gallery for the Reading School of Art's finalist interim show, Connectivité– Reconnected. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've moved our art exhibitions online. Alongside our virtual gallery, we have a series of artist interviews being released via our Instagram page tomorrow, and the following day, our live-hosted video showreel streamed to you via Facebook.
Hello, I am Jasmine and I made the virtual gallery. Using art steps, I created the virtual space modelled off of our very own Studio 4. So many of our finalists submitted amazing works, so I made sure that they were curated in a way that best elevates them. I noticed that from the many images on Google Drive that there was an equal number of monochrome works as well as vibrant amalgamations of colour. I decided that rather than curating them thematically, I'd place the works with a pattern in mind, colour contrasted with black and white. I feel like this choice means each work complements one another, making for a connected exhibition. So please enjoy the virtual gallery opening with our fabulous hosts.
So we're now going to go to our first work by Emily Ferris.
So here we have our first work, which is Self by Emily Ferris, which is in response to the distortions that social media can create on an individual's sense of self due to unrealistic standards portrayed by places such as Instagram.
I think I find what is most striking for this piece myself is the obviously you have the black background and the pupils of the eyes are very intense to look at. And also the position of the mouth, which has been totally rotated by 180 degrees.
I'm quite intrigued because you still have some form of standard facial feature positioning, and yet they're so disjointed at the same time. Like the fact that the nose and two of the eyes are still positioned, so it's very legible as a face.
So our next piece is Percent by Emily Brewer that explores. This work responds to misinformation regarding the COVID-19 pandemic.
I think the first thing it reminds me of is glitches on a screen, but also the colors used are very, very vibrant, especially on the piece on the left. Sort of, I think knowing the sort of background information, I'm intrigued to know how they came up with the amalgamation of the different shapes and choices of color. You can see some I think, yeah, we can see more repetition on the right one. Obviously you have the smaller red squares and then obviously triangles, and then that's flipped the other way around and then flipped back again. Yeah, I would be very intrigued to know how the artist, if they put this data through a computer generated source to come up with these images.
I think in that sense it reflects the confusion of the information that it's actually representing.
Yeah, the fact that as a viewer we can't even tell how necessarily the image has been put together. The information in front of us. Yeah.
So next we have A Body in Grayscale by Lydia Morris, exploring body and self-worth, representing the body in its most natural form in order to provoke the patriarchal gaze and empower women. I think these are really powerful images.
Yeah, I think that was my first impression of the work. Obviously, three of the images are almost quite similar close-ups of the body, which has been overlaid and the opacity has been changed. But then you have one image that is obviously darker than all the rest and has this zoomed out, and you can see the whole body surrounded by darkness, which is quite compelling.
So next we have Lightwash by Tosan Ebison. This work captures Tosan's emotions and perceptions of nature at the time of creating the image. Her work focuses on materiality, how colors and gestures come together to create chapters within each composition. These are really beautiful works. They remind me of almost like impressionist painting, like very soft pastel colors, but then you can't actually tell what anything is. Everything seems so like abstracted. Like I can sort of piece out bits that look like they belong to plants, but everything's so like altered and edited to the point that it's almost beyond recognition.
You can almost cloud watch these paintings. Feel of something that you could gaze at for undetermined amounts of time.
Definitely.
I think the use of obviously some of the shapes you can sort of just make out, like, is it a flower, is it a leaf, is it like a background like some bushes or something, but I think the use of green for me, I think makes it obviously nature without even reading the caption, and even though that the images are so distorted, this very natural color.
Our next work is a series by Anjali Temple. The first piece is titled At Addison Ray Verified, which is part 1 of the series, and then part 2 of the series is At Anjali Art. And these form a series called TikTok, which is a curation of found materials, animation, and video to critically contrast the reception of 2 different TikTok videos, exploring the relationship between follower counts and whether works are received well or poorly by like the public based on how many followers a person has.
I think it's a very direct show. Like the point they're trying to make is very direct, and to have like the information displayed of like you have the post, then you have the comments, and to be able to contrast them right next to each other is very clear.
So our next piece is Alleyway by Amila Sadra. This was a painting of the first house that Amila remembers living in. She was missing it pre-lockdown and took a visit to the street during Christmas and found that the whole street was actually derelict. It really captures the sense of loss that you know, when you return to a place that you haven't seen in a long time, and the way that memories get a bit distorted over time as well.
I think the sort of sadness, there's obviously quite a lot of dark tones, especially in the foreground, and they kind of obviously appear again like off into kind of the distance, and the distortion is like the way the sort of colors kind of blend in and out, and you're not quite sure, is it part of the fence, is it part of the background, and obviously the way that we remember things, like things get distorted.
I feel myself quite pulled into it as well. There's something quite compelling that just draws you into the image itself, with the pathway and the way everything's curving around it. It's like you want to go down there, you want to go that way, which is quite interesting with the sense of loss and missing. The next artwork is The View by Kirsten Honeywell, an ode to outside from the mind's idealized and fantastical memory. The artist says, it's a dream of my culture exploring my local landscape.
This is actually 2 works that are titled separate things but within the same theme. You can see how they kind of relate to each other, as they're both to do with Kristen's hometown and her place where she feels like most happy, and memories with that.
So this work is also by Kirsten Honeywell, titled With Love from Las Cuevas.
I found it quite interesting, the choice of shapes that these like scenes have been placed within. I think on first impression I thought they were like sort of, you know, like you get those little paintings of scenes on rocks.
I see the right one more as like a geode that's been split open, and instead of the precious crystals and stuff inside, you have the scene and the memory from the artist.
I think it's interesting that the artist says an ode to outside, which I think in the context of lockdown and the pandemic, it's this imagining of like all outdoor life, but then like she specifically refers back to like her culture and a place that she probably isn't able to be right now. So the next work is a series by elif and taran. So we have from right to left, Mr. Jones, and then drone recording the Noctilucan Dream, and Linked Souls. Eli Taran's practice currently revolves around the pandemic and its impact on the climate's well-being as well as our own. During lockdown, he has created acrylic paintings and pencil illustrations to accompany short stories based on the themes of recovery, growth, and empathy for the world and its people.
There's a flow to these images that sort of goes through all of them, which is quite enjoyable. You can sort of journey from left to right in an arc that takes the eye back round.
I think the shape, obviously in the drone piece, the shape in the middle is almost sort of circular, which is echoed even more by the bright colours, and I think that brings about at least the movement of the eye in that sort of circular motion. There's a mystical nature of storytelling. The theme of storytelling really does come across.
I'd agree there. It's quite interesting to have this like dynamic, bold color, abstract painting between these two sort of more monochrome images.
So our next piece is Reproduction by Gabia Milioskaita, which explores the memory as fallible through expanded painting. Gabia uses acrylic, lily petals, and thread on canvas, A3 photomontage prints along with collected items from the past year to conflate extracts of these decaying moments.
What's interesting about this is Gabia messaged me saying, so this is the situation, and as many of us are, she is set up in her bedroom and wanted the works to be on a corner space just because then it works better curatorially speaking.
When you're looking at this corner space, it makes you feel like, you know, you're surrounded by it in a way. It definitely creates an environment in and of itself.
I think it is interesting that you're surrounded by these nature elements, but then they're still clearly on very angular photos and boards, and you're also in the angular corner. So it's kind of that combination.
Yeah, between like the naturalistic and the geometric. So our next piece is Unique 2021 by Ora Williams, which uses AI machine learning and generative sound and code to create this image that is a still from a video that will be shared in our live show reel happening on Thursday, the 25th of February. So do come watch that.
It's a really interesting video actually, because you hear this pronunciation, the word eventually does get weird and you only say something too many times.
Yeah.
And it kind of dissociates yourself from the situation, and then accompanied with this kind of moving face. But it's obviously meant to be seen as a video and as a projection. So this is a screen grab just to give you a bit of an overview of what Or's practice is.
The image itself is very, very like dark and almost reminds me of paint when it's been played with and layered and reworked, left to dry and then cracked again. Just like this like endless attention to just changing it constantly. So our next artist is Amy Shears, and they use light, color, and sound to create a multi-sensory experience. Pink on the Inside 2021 is an exploration of transformation, movement, and finitude in relation to nature and the body.
So this is just really kind of delightful to look at. Like the colors are really pleasing, and it's just really interesting to see how these reflections are being used as part of the artwork.
I think what's mind-boggling to me is the fact that it's obviously we're all watching on a flat screen with a flat image in a two-dimensional of a gallery wall space, but yeah, it's still so clearly three-dimensional and with volume and depth. I also enjoy the presentation and the creation of the fact that you've got like the large overall image, but then you've got pieces taken from it which almost replicate the pieces that it's made up from in itself.
So our next artwork is Lasswade by Kirsten Simpson. Lasswade 2021 is a series of 3 A3 artworks manipulated in Photoshop. The artist says that these images have been taken while on walks in her village during the most recent lockdown, where the artist recorded thoughts and parts of conversations that she had while walking around the village with her family, and each image is accompanied by a corresponding snippet of text. These pieces have different titles, so this is The Path is Made by Walking. The piece in the middle is titled I Walk with My Mother and Her Mother, and the piece on the right is titled It is the Same and Yet Forever in a State of Flux.
I think they work so well as black and white images, and the water one about being in a state of flux, I just immediately made me think of the kind of realism paintings of Via Kelman's, where she paints these really intense water landscapes. And also you can't really tell, like that body of water could be anything. That could be a bathtub, that could be a pond, it could be a river. So I quite like the ambiguity with the works as well.
The footprint one, again, I would say is a kind of outside perspective. You don't actually see the walk or the mother or their mother. You see the evidence left behind from it, as if you're following, perhaps.
Our next piece is Reference to Saint Eulalia by Tom Holboringer.
This is a painting informed through readings of decadent literature and exploring of his own painting language and what this says. Romantic representation and layers of often unrelated or personal references interests Tom, reflecting on a world in decline yet seeing moments of fleeting beauty.
I think the first most striking thing is the position of the figure. They appear to be bent over backwards, like with their arms flailing out along the ground, and their sort of hair is like almost traveling along the ground.
So interestingly, after doing a cursory Google search, Eulalia or Saint Eulalia was a co-patron saint of Barcelona, who was a 13-year-old Roman Christian virgin who suffered martyrdom in Barcelona during the persecution of Christians in the reign of Emperor Diocletian near the end of the ban on Christianity. So I wonder.
I think knowing that information, it almost comes across like it's been romanticized, like a romantic tragedy almost.
Yeah.
I get that sort of from obviously the position of the body. Seems almost tragic. Like, are they looking up at the trees? Are they alive? Like, and also the sort of appeared dismemberment of like the bottom half of them. But then obviously they're surrounded by this very, like, you know, peaceful leaves and trees.
The dove itself seems to be part of the forest to me, while the figure stands out quite a lot. So our next work was submitted by Ritchie, and it is a series of 3 different images, and they are untitled.
I think the first thing that stands out to me is the color choice. Obviously, using pink and blue is very, I would deem it quite political. Like, the association I have automatically with pink and blue is the gender binary. I don't know if this is intentional or not, but that's the first thing that stands out to me looking at this piece.
I think I'm drawn closer, like there's a definite mystery, and I want to look at the images closer and see what little details I might be able to pick out, what clues do we actually have to work with, and where is the texture that they're backed onto. The presentation itself is quite interesting, that it's a 3, but it's presented in this sort of rectangle, so you kind of would feel like there's something missing.
I mean, when I looked at these works, I saw the individual like boxes within, and it kind of gave me this idea that it was lost and found objects. It was kind of these similar things that we see all the time, like a receipt or like dying flowers or a bed. And I also felt like it kind of represented maybe an experience during lockdown. So that's why I put them in this order, because I felt like not every piece of the puzzle was there, not the whole story was there. Maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to know that's the whole story.
Our next artist is Abigail Pinkney, and they have submitted a lockdown series of 10 small 7x10 black and white acrylic paintings that follow the artist's journey through the 10 months of lockdown in the UK. Each painting acts as a diary entry for each of the 10 months.
So I thought what was really interesting about these was, I think we all went on this similar sort of journey. I think it's very relatable, especially when we compare to what happened last year. I mean, this was so fun to curate because there were so many things to do. It was actually really, really good. It was trying to find the best way to give the work justice, because I did put it all onto like one Photoshop document, but then the quality lessened and I didn't want to compromise on quality.
They're very beautiful and emotive, and I quite enjoy that you can see a journey by reading them right to left or left to right, or you could select an image to look at closer and just think about the emotion and the posture that's shown there.
I think the sort of main emotions that kind of come across for me are the sense of frustration and sadness, with sort of the covering of the face in the second image from the left, and this escalating to the final image on the right, where the face is unseeable because they've put their head down onto their arms. I think looking at it, obviously if you read it as like a picture diary entry for each month from left to right, if you try and imagine for the 11th month, what would the figure look like then? Because they've already got their head down on their arms. Where do they go from there?
So our next work is Masculinity Is by Ellie Poole. Ellie writes, as my dissertation explores gender roles and sexism in advertising, I have become interested in gendered spaces and conventional femininity, where a woman's femininity is often seen as her level of value or desire. I've enjoyed exploring the painterly aspects of studying flowers, as well as analysing the societal role that they play in femininity, whilst critiquing the way in which popular culture sells us stereotypes, gendered spaces, narrow standards of beauty, and toxic masculinity. My work is just about the material than it is about the idea, where I continue to play around with expressive painterly gestures and mixed media techniques.
I find it interesting, the just reading the description, the two topics that have kind of been said very closely after each other is the standards of beauty and toxic masculinity, which aren't always necessarily seen in the same field park, can often almost be like in opposition to each other, like the idea of masculinity and the idea of femininity, and femininity being more associated with beauty. But in this piece, obviously, we see these very beautiful array of expressive flowers, very bright, very colorful, and the bold statement, the word masculinity.
I think it definitely subverts our expectations of masculinity in a really powerful way, because like Ellie is saying that she's exploring femininity in the work, but then masculinity is what is written literally on the painting. And we're looking at, these things that are associated with femininity and then thinking about, but what if masculinity could look like this too? So our next piece is Little Dream Dress 2050 by Halima Hussein, which envisions a dress from the future that has come through a magical portal to showcase its design and style. The work revolves around the idea of ecotopia, and that there will be an increase of minimalist fashion and technology merged in the future. Aspects of the work address issues of sea pollution and fashion consumption, but also a hope for a better and sustainable future.
I think it's quite an interesting approach to talking about these issues of sea pollution and sustainability. And obviously, the artist has suggested a ecotopia, as they've put in their statement, that actually it's not just the kind of doom and gloom kind of this is really bad, rising sea levels, but it's almost showing like the potential of a future, almost the, you know, if you can see it coming into fruition before it does, which I think is really valuable to be able to kind of show the potential of this futuristic way of fashion existing and being sustainable.
Our next piece is It's Yet to Be Beautiful by Ella Wisniewska, which is a poster inviting viewers to see and experience a short video called Frustration. Here the artist intends to capture the romanticized essence within the video and its conclusion, ruins, a metaphor of the state of politics worldwide.
I think the idea of potential and hope is still very encapsulated in this as well. Like the image of the rose that has the potential to be beautiful, but is also dead. So there's that question of is it too late or can it be changed? And the keyword of yet is really like important to this, I think, in the idea of hope. I think it is quite a dramatic claim also that it's yet to be, which could suggest it never has been, and that any other form hasn't been successful in beauty.
Yeah.
And this idea of beauty and function as well is quite an interesting one.
Our next piece is a series by Phoebe Alberon called Pieces, which is a collection of paintings that explores items from dreams in abstract form, focusing on the impacts of color and shape to construct a visual language.
The number of works that Phoebe's actually done is crazy, and the kind of how they're all so different from one another, but then are so cohesive together, I think is really interesting. I just think it's a really different take on dreams, and it's not what you anticipate, especially for me, because I dream in black and white. So for me, this is a revelation.
I'm interested in the curation of this work as well, since there are so many pieces, but just 4 images have been selected, and they all show lines between the work, as opposed to whole works or individual works. It's always the works connecting to each other.
I think it's a fantastic interpretation of something so like intangible as dreams, because sometimes you can only really remember a dream as a feeling or as a vague collection of nonsensical imagery. So I think this combining of those concepts and then applying them a sort of abstracted way, I think that's a really compelling way of dealing with intangible concepts. Our next piece is Unnatural Confinement by Claire Shepard, which is a still from a 9-minute film that features the gradual destruction of a concrete block, which, when broken into, releases a black, viscous liquid out of its cracks. Through the juxtaposition of a rigid and unmoving material with one that is fluid and changeable, Unnatural Confinement brings to light the abnormality of a restricted and isolated living, and reveals our growing desperation to regain freedom.
What's interesting about this is I watched the video, and Claire spoke to me about wanting it on a large scale because it's meant to be a projection. And I watched the video and I kept thinking this would be so interesting as a projection, just because the black is so intense. And if you had that just as like a flat image projected on a wall, it would feel like it was actually coming off the wall and onto the gallery floor.
It's interesting the interaction between having a still and a video of this kind of journey, because as a video it really does show the kind of journey, but somehow they've managed to choose a image from that to represent the cracking and showing the contact between the hands that are affecting it is quite interesting, that interaction.
I think it's I'm very curious about the decision to choose this one prominent still from this 9-minute video, and sort of the thinking process behind which part of the video, because obviously you could show you know, at every single minute, or you could, you know, sort of show the story developing, but actually from this image and the description we gain all that information. and plus with the larger scale, obviously the materiality of it is more clear, even though it is digital. The thick black paint running down this like pillar-like object is still very prominent.
Our next work is Blend In by Choi-Fu-Chi Jeff. Jeff says, due to the pandemic happening worldwide lately, surgical masks have become part of our daily lives. The work is a sculpture and at the same time a portrait. With the surgical mask blended into the face, the loss of identity was shown in the piece.
It is quite shocking how compelling a piece can be when, like, I'm not entirely sure the materials they use to mount the mask on, but obviously the only details of the face and the idea of this loss of identity, you can still see that a face is wearing it the way the mask has been shaped, and also how you would use to the elastic on the mask almost outlines half of a face. I think it's incredible the fact that this one material is showing these very complex things. Like, how can you show identity with like two materials? It's a big feat to try and accomplish, and I think it's been done really well here.
Our next piece is titled Caesarea by Olivia Connolly, which is inspired by the minimalistic lines of Japanese prints. Olivia has aimed to depict illustrations of human touch and emotion. Using a contrast of vibrant colors, the figures in the painting are dramatized in their position, but somehow portray a calming concept of reliance on each other to exist. The piece's title comes from the Japanese word for touch.
I find the right image where the figures are balled together quite familiar and quite almost desperate, but quite loving. Whereas the image on the left of how they're interacting is less of a familiar, regular motif in art, I find.
I think something I quite like about the work is the mirroring of the images where they've been reflected. And I find it quite interesting the fact that obviously the piece is the Japanese word for touch. However, the reflections, there is some gaps in the reflections. Like, you can see the legs, like the feet are touching almost, or are just about, but then the rest of the body, there is still space between them. I do find it a very interesting choice to obviously this idea of touch, and you have the figures touching, but yet the reflections are only partially touching.
Our next piece is Allison and Magicland, a digital flipbook by Shannon Vincent. The flipbook is a preliminary mock flipbook of a Disney-inspired children's story. I had a look through it myself, and I think it looks really fantastic. I think Shannon's created these characters and telling the story and showing the way that this person is like going through this adventure. But I think it's really interesting as well to present the like front cover of a book, an illustrated like story in a gallery, and the conversation about like artwork being like the transience of what art can be defined as.
It is interesting, again, this idea of taking one image and one moment from a movement or collection or video, and how that is selected and how that represents everything.
Our next piece is another diptych. This is titled A COVID Christmas by Sydney Akbar. So we have this image on the left that's been spliced up of what appears to be a photograph or a scene in a Zoom call. And then here on the right, you've also got these figures clearly in a Zoom call. And what Sydney has written about the piece is A COVID Christmas is a series of paintings that are shown based on Sydney's experience during COVID-19 at the Christmas period. There are overlaid sounds on what Sydney did during the holidays that is included in a video of this piece that you can see in the video screening that we'll be hosting. But these paintings are made up of a photo of Sydney herself, her brother, her mum, and a scout call with the rest of the family on Christmas Day.
I find it interesting the decision to include the facial features and expressions of Sydney and obviously the two family members she has with her, but then also on the right hand side the facial features have been totally removed, and how the wanting to be connected at a time where families often gather together and trying to do this virtually. And I think it really does come across that struggle.
Yeah, I think it definitely speaks to the way that sometimes speaking to people online can feel a bit impersonal, and that if you're not seeing the rest of the person and all you're seeing is sort of from the shoulders up, it can feel a bit like you're not really experiencing the full experience of being with that person and sharing time with them. And
I think the contrast of the lack of faces shown next to the faces really does get that across, even though the face would be the only thing that you might get to see, or the main thing you might get to see over a video call. It really creates that lack of personalization to compare to physically being with someone.
I think also emotional connection is what I see, a sort of sense of loss. Like there's a facial features are very expressive, and being able to feel connected to the other person's emotions, I think is something that can be a big struggle virtually than rather in person.
Like how you might comfort your loved one digitally is very different to how you might comfort your loved one when you're in person.
And I think that sense of loss is very much expressed in this piece on the right as well, where there's like distance placed in the image between the figures, and one of the figures has been quite literally like split in half, and this feeling of, you know, being in lockdown and not seeing your family and feeling so far away from them, it's been transformed into the physical space between images on canvas. So our next work is An Out Day Emerged by Joshua Obamboateng, an acrylic interpretation of a comic book strip.
Presenting it in this format does really emphasize the being told or an inner movement through time.
I believe this was done on 2 canvases that have been slotted together. Although there is this flow, there is also some separation.
You've kind of been transported, but you've still got the same background colouring, the sense of the same sort of universe potentially.
Having this freeze frame of a story, there is that it just leads to more questions around what emotions are they trying to express, what is the text that are in the little speech bubbles.
I think the top 2 panels, I do feel like shock and confusion expressed by the facial expressions, despite like half the face covered by a mask, which is quite interesting with current circumstances with mask wearing. Also added faces, so whether those faces are the face or whether they are a mask to the face is unknown.
Our next piece is Octopussy Triptych 3000 by Forrest Davidson, and we actually have our artist right here in the room with us. So I was wondering, Forrest, would you like to tell us a bit about your work?
Yeah, so actually another event we are running this week is the artist interviews, where I go into more information about this artwork. So other artists have done similar, and we will be releasing those artist interviews tomorrow, so watch out for those. Just a bit about my work. The caption reads, "Not much has changed, but we live underwater, swimming towards a utopian future, reclaiming and remapping my body with my body. Octopussy Triptych 3000 offers an erotic yet non-explicit, animalistic yet intelligent embodiment, devouring those fallen temptation gaze in the blink of an eye."
These are very compelling images in terms of color choice, I find they sort of demand attention in their own way. And seeing all three of them side by side, you start to notice repeating motifs and interactions between them.
I think in light of like earlier discussions with Forrest and talking about this work, I think you can very much see the way that the body has been used in this really sort of unexpected way of sort of photographing and then removing itself again, so only the silhouette is left and it's just the hints of a body. How far can you remove the body while it still remains recognizable as a body? It becomes quite apparent here, where you can tell that there are body parts, but they're morphed and changed. They're, as the title suggests, reminiscent of an octopus.
Almost morphing to the point where they're reminiscent of other bodies as well. The use of body as a material itself is very interesting. It brings up questions of whether these could be self-portraits or whether they are now something else. For a self-portrait, you might paint a likeness, whereas these are literally painted onto the body and then mutated and manipulated from there.
Next we've got an Untitled series by Abby Bromwich. Abby writes, "My practice focuses on modern day feminism and the use of the body within this. My work explores ideas of female autonomy over their bodies and ideas of being able to present this in a way that they choose. I've created drawings in different styles and from different angles, layered upon typically female colors and items, such as flowers. The foreground is then contrasted with these images in much more empowered women claiming autonomy of their bodies and representing the progression from other outdated ideals."
I really like the curatorial decision to place these artworks next to my triptych. I think the use of floral imagery and relating themes around femininity and the female form, decisions made around placing objects and pieces next to each other in the exhibition space was made themes and contrasting color palettes to see these very soft.
Yeah, it's intelligent curation on the subject matter to have such juxtaposition despite similarities.
I'm curious to know the choices of the parts of the body, because although they are a series, there is some separation that comes across with the different choices of color background.
Yeah, it's interesting the choices with what is manipulated about the body and what is represented between both different types of artwork, actually, and how they have manipulated the body in a different way and how they've represented it through different media and different methods. The disembodiment of the artwork is also very interesting in that it's always parts, it's never a whole necessarily. And that question of what is a whole of a body is then brought to mind.
The next work we've got is Home Sweet Home by Sarah Simper, which is a mixed media piece which incorporates sewing and painting onto the surface of a newspaper. The image is of a chair in Sarah's house, and in using it as a focus of multiple works this term, Sarah sought to examine the ways in which the pandemic has caused domestic environments to become stagnant and repetitive. Her use of newspaper was both a way of reusing the otherwise obsolete materials which litter our homes and an attempt to create an interplay between the private and public spheres. The traditionally comforting phrase "home sweet home," for example, becomes ironic when combined with the more sinister political context of the newspaper. I think the way that this work responds to lockdown is really interesting. It's quite sort of bitter and expresses some of the frustrations that people have, portrays this in a really sort of sweet looking way with a very soft looking pink chair, and the text of the newspaper is somewhat obscured. It looks like it's been sort of painted over.
It's interesting the soft comfort and potentially informality of the chair on top of the formal angular presenting newspaper, but both could still be found within the home.
Okay, sadly Jasmine is not here to talk about her own work, but We've finally moved on to the middle of Studio 4 in digital form, where our first work here is Jasmine Winter's series of small paintings titled Small Canvases, Huge Problem, in all caps. Jasmine writes to download the Louis Marchand app from the App Store to see how the landscapes should look. So if you pull out your phone, have a look at this through an inversion filter, you'll see that the colors have been inverted. And Jasmine writes that this series is a comment on climate change. She uses polyfilla to create intense impasto textures. I think as a sort of approach to landscape painting, this is really compelling because it completely like disrupts what we think of the landscape to look like, because these are not colors that we typically find in landscapes for the most part, and it sort of distorts the way that we perceive like our world and our landscape, and it sort of brings to attention the fact that climate change is a really pressing issue. I do want to say that we do have an interview coming out this week as well with Jasmine, where she talks a bit more about her work.
I think initially looking at the work before the filter and this sort of, I feel quite unsettled by the color palette. I don't know if it's the obviously without the filter, what appears to be very, very dark black on 3 of the images. It is quite compelling. Like there seems to be something that just doesn't feel quite right.
Our next piece is a series by Ava Nicholson. So Ava writes that these collection of manipulated shots and photographs shows the drift in foreground and background timelines within a space or a shot within a film. Timelines as a term was identified in my project early on to represent different narratives. Foreground narratives tend to be more meaningful and more closely associated with feelings, memories, and emotional connection, while background timelines convey ordinary, everyday experiences and a continuation of things that are often surface level, dealing with senses, time, and physical experiences. These 4 pieces, An Autumn Afternoon, Taxi Driver, Frankie and Johnny, are shots taken from Ava's film. I think it's interesting that they don't use up the full space. A negative space being sort of used partially but not fully, and then the inclusion of the text on the images as well sort of makes me wonder what's the particular significance of these shots. And I feel like this is something I'd spend quite a bit of time just looking at and thinking about why these decisions were made and what in particular was significant about these different images.
It's quite interesting to have the multi-dimensional look into art that we have offered during these different show events. The fact that we can offer a digital gallery and also the video art can be seen during the interim, to be able to actually have comparison and new dimension into the different artists' work. Irregularly regular placement.
Yeah. Our next work is by Sarah Smart. This work is titled These 4 Walls by Sarah Smart. This is a sculptural piece made up of layers of plasterboard. Each individual piece is made up of 4 layers, and the shapes represent the floor plan of Sarah's home that she's currently confined to within lockdown.
It's interesting to see a lens like this placed on a home, because although it's specific to their home, you could imagine a floor plan of other buildings as well, the home that you're in as well, potentially.
I think the shapes that have been used aren't so specific that you can translate it onto thinking about the place in which you feel confined at the moment, your house, your flat where you're living. And I think So the decision to present these pieces on what appears to be a cloth or potentially like a bedroom, like beds.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ambiguity to the shapes because I can't really discern what might be a bed or a table or anything like that. Makes this familiar space of the home turn into this really unfamiliar, confusing space. There's a lot of shapes in this that I'm unable to identify or place. It's got a rigidity to it. So our final work through our walkthrough of the virtual gallery is Untitled by Lauren Geit, which explores social class inequality in Britain through Lauren's own anxieties and the contempt shown by the reigning upper classes. And this is shown through 8 images, which detail different sort of scenery, and there's written, like handwritten text and script, and images of repeating figures in the work. So I was in a crit with Lauren where she was talking about this piece, and she was talking about how the text on these works are sort of expressing the anxieties that she personally has and that a lot of people she knows has about like living as a working class person in the UK. And this has been juxtaposed with images of council housing and the silhouette of Boris Johnson. And I think the work appears almost diaristic in a way. The writing looks messy and not sort of refined, but in a way that you can really see there's a lot of emotion to it. Everyone has a look through what Lauren has written and see what has been said, because I think there are things that a lot of people are feeling and a lot of people are wishing weren't our problems at the minute.
I think the repeated motif of the silhouette throughout several different pieces just shows the impact and effect as well, that it just transcends across all the work, how these conditions may transcend across people's lives and affect everything in their life as well.
One thing this particular part of the series reminds me of is the blue writing, is the statement that I've seen spread across other art schools. Obviously, art has been one of the schools that have had to close. So in the university, the art department is not open under lockdown restrictions. And in a sort of protest against this to the government, these statements saying art is not an essential course I have seen circulating online, and the repetition here, I can always make art, I can always make art. It's interesting if the question is being posed or a statement. It's quite hard to understand maybe the agitation behind the sort of fragmented statements, where it says my degree mean anything, in my mind reminding me straight away of this statement that I've seen circulating. Do that art practice and create artwork without a studio space, and that being able to come together in this virtual space to be able to share our collective artworks together. This walkthrough was to give a bit of a sense of how it would be if we were able to be in our Studio 4 space and walk around and see people's artworks presented in that format.
I think say it's very impressive what's been created here despite everything.
Even though this isn't the same as a in-person gallery, I think there's a lot of we're able to showcase our work still. We've got all these amazing things, and I wouldn't have seen this work had it not been for this gallery. So it's great that art is still able to be visible, and you know, we're able to still experience art. Thank you to everyone who's like made work, and thank you to everyone who's been involved in working on this exhibition, and thank you to Jasmine for curating this absolutely fantastic virtual gallery, and thank you to the viewers as well.
Stay posted via our Facebook page and watch out for the interviews that are being released tomorrow at 5 p.m. on our Instagram, and then the following day our live hosted showreel, which will be via Facebook Live. Look forward to seeing you then. Take care. Bye for now.